Many could argue he's the best racing driver to ever live and one of the true legends of motorsport. He produced some of the greatest racing the world has ever seen, and in his F1 career he became a triple world champion. So today I'm covering the complete history of the man himself, Ayrton Senna da Silva. Senna was born on the 21st of March 1960 in Sao Paulo, Brazil. He was the middle child of wealthy landowner Milton da Silva and his wife Nied Senna da Silva. At a young age, it was apparent to everyone he had an interest in cars and motorsport, with his first kart being built by his dad using a 1-horsepower lawnmower engine. At the age of 13, Senna entered his first karting race at his local racetrack Interlagos. He started his very first race on pole position and was leading for most of the race, but at some point he collided with another driver and was forced to retire. Despite this unfortunate mistake, he was definitely proving that he was more than capable of becoming an incredible driver. By 1977, Senna had finished his time at high school and decided to drop out of college to become a dedicated racing driver. Later that year, the 17-year-old Senna won the South American Kart Championship before entering the Karting World Championship from 1978 to 1982. It was at this time Senna met his first rival, his teammate Terry Fullerton, who Senna would later describe in 1993 as being the most satisfying person he's ever raced against, since at the time there wasn't any politics or money involved, just pure racing. Fullerton never made it past go-karts, but it's still amazing to think that Senna got more satisfaction out of racing him than the likes of Alain Prost or Nelson Piquet. At around this time in 1981, Senna left his home in Brazil and moved to England to start his career in single-seater racing. In 1981 he entered the Formula Ford Championship and would go on to become the champion later that year, winning 12 of the 20 races. The following year, in 1982, he decided to remain in Formula Ford, once again becoming the champion, this time winning an incredible 21 of 28 races. At this time, Ayrton Senna still went by his birth name Ayrton da Silva. But in Brazil, da Silva is the country's most common surname, so instead he chose to adopt his mother's maiden name to become Ayrton Senna. By this point, Senna had proved to the world he was capable of competing in Formula 1, but it would still take one more year before he would finally achieve his goal. In 1983, he took part in the British Formula 3 Championship and won 12 of the 20 races, including 9 in a row. Senna carried on his winning streak and won the championship on the final race of the season, ahead of fellow driver Martin Brundle. After this, it wouldn't be long before both Senna and Brundle would be signed up to drive in next year's season of Formula 1. In 1984, Senna was signed by Toleman, with his new teammate being motorcycle world champion Johnny Cassetto. His first race in Formula 1 will be the 1984 Brazilian Grand Prix at Rio de Janeiro, taking him back to his home country. In the race, he retired from turbo failure after qualifying 17th on the grid, which was expected of a fairly new backmarker team like Toleman. The next race at Kyalami in South Africa would give Senna his first championship point in F1 after scoring an amazing 6th from 13th on the grid. His first couple of races showed to the world how skilled he was, but it wouldn't be until the Monaco Grand Prix later that year where he produced one of the greatest drives in his whole career. The Monaco Grand Prix began on the 3rd of June 1984 with Alain Prost on pole and Senna starting 13th. The track was completely soaked in rain, and this gave Senna the opportunity to show everyone his now legendary skills in the wet. During the race, in the hands of Senna, the normally uncompetitive Toleman car was quicker than the likes of Ferrari or McLaren. While other drivers crashed or spun off, Senna soared through the field, even taking the fastest lap of the race on lap 24. Nearing the end of the race, Senna was closing in on first place Alain Prost before the race was stopped on lap 32 after the rain was considered too bad to continue racing.
Prost is waving his hand. Prost goes through, waving his hand at the officials. He wants to stop the race, and who can blame him?
Senna actually passed Prost to take the lead on the final lap, but the rules stated that your finishing position was the last time you crossed the line before the red flag was waved to stop the session, robbing Senna of his first Grand Prix win in Formula 1. Despite this unfortunate event, second place was still an unbelievable achievement, especially in a generally uncompetitive Toleman. After this race, Senna would only go on to finish 3 of the next 10 races due to how hideously unreliable the Toleman was. The first of these races was the Canadian Grand Prix at Circuit Gilles Villeneuve, where he finished 7th place just outside the points. The next was the British Grand Prix at Brands Hatch, where he would once again show his talent, coming home in an incredible 3rd place. And again at the Portuguese Grand Prix at Estoril, he drove to another third place finish, truly proving to the world his insane talent behind the wheel. Despite the fact he only finished 6th of 16 races that year, his results put him 9th in the championship, with his talent gaining him attention from Lotus. The next year, in 1985, he left Toleman for the legendary Lotus F1 team with his new teammate Elio D'Angelis. Lotus's iconic black and gold car was way more competitive than his previous Toleman and gave him a chance to fight for race wins and maybe even the championship. In the second race of the 1985 season at Estoril, Senna dominated, winning his first ever race and pole position in Formula 1. He won again in Belgium that year, but his next win after that would prove to be one of his most famous. At the 1986 Spanish Grand Prix, Senna took a memorable victory from second place Nigel Mansell by a tiny 1400th of a second.
As things were, Senna won by a whisker in the closest Grand Prix final for years.
To this day, this is one of the closest finishes in F1 history and will always be remembered as one of Senna's greatest races. Over his year at Toleman and 3 years at Lotus, it was clear that he was a force to be reckoned with, bringing home 24 podiums and 6 race wins. He was clearly a worthy candidate for the World Championship, and in 1988 he would be given a shot for glory when being signed by none other than McLaren. Senna joined McLaren in 1988 against his teammate, the double world champion Alain Prost. Little did they know the combination of Prost, Senna and the McLaren MP44 would become the most dominant setup in Formula 1's history. Throughout the year, Senna won 8 races, which at the time became the record for the most amount of wins in a single season, ahead of Jim Clark's 7 in 1963. His most memorable moment of the year came at the 1988 Monaco Grand Prix qualifying, where Senna produced one of the greatest laps the world has ever seen. He took pole position from his teammate Alain Prost by an unbelievable 1.5 seconds on a lap many would consider Senna's greatest performance in his whole career. People were stunned that the more inexperienced Ayrton Senna had demolished the double world champion Alain Prost, especially by such a massive margin. After the session, Senna was left as stunned as everyone else, and when being asked about his lap, he said this: "I was kind of driving it by instinct. I was in a different dimension. I was in a tunnel well beyond my conscious understanding. Some moments when I'm actually driving just detach me completely from anything else. I said to myself that was the maximum for me. No room for anything more." Unfortunately though, the race didn't go as smoothly for Senna as qualifying did. On lap 67, Senna was leading the race until a mistake at Portier sent him into the barriers and out of the Grand Prix, handing the win to his arch-rival Alain Prost. The season reached its climax at the Japanese Grand Prix later that year, where either Senna or Prost would become the 1988 world champion. And Senna eventually clinched the championship from Alain Prost by a mere 3 points after a hard-fought battle for the win. Ayrton Senna's dream had finally come true. He had become a Formula 1 world champion. When I said earlier that in 1988 the combination of Prost and Senna in McLaren MP44s was the most dominant in F1 history, I wasn't joking. Between the two drivers, McLaren won 15 of the 16 races that year, with the only exception being the Italian Grand Prix won by Gerhard Berger for Ferrari. This record for the highest percentage of wins from one team in a single season has stayed the same over 30 years later. The next year, Senna and Prost stayed at McLaren for the 1989 season, with Prost eventually becoming the world champion at a controversial Japanese Grand Prix. By the start of 1989, it was apparent Senna and Prost had developed an intense rivalry, and by the Japanese Grand Prix it had turned into full-on hatred for each other. At the race, Senna would have to win to become the world champion, and if he didn't, it would go to Prost. On lap 46, Senna attempted an overtake on Prost at the chicane, only for Prost to turn in and collide with him, leaving them both stuck on the track.
To any of them, this is the opportunity that Senna's looking for, and he's going through. Ouch! Oh my goodness, this is fantastic! They meet. This is what we were fearing might happen during the race. And that means to say that Prost has won the World Championship. Alain Prost, World Champion of 1989.
Senna's car was then push-started by marshals, and he regained the lead and won the race, until he was later disqualified for cutting the chicane during the push start. People still argue today whether this disqualification was justified, and Senna was robbed of a second world title. But still, Senna couldn't do anything about it, and Prost inherited the 1989 World Championship. The next year, in 1990, Prost had moved to Ferrari, with Senna staying at McLaren with his new teammate Gerhard Berger. Despite Prost leaving McLaren, Senna and Prost's fierce rivalry carried on in 1990 just as it had done in the last 2 years. Throughout the year, Senna had claimed 6 race wins and was on course to become the champion. That year's championship would be once again decided at the Japanese Grand Prix, with Senna on pole and Prost in second. The race began and it wouldn't take long before the championship was decided. In fact, it would only take a couple seconds. Senna would be champion if Prost didn't score any points, and on the first lap at the first corner, this happened. Senna was crowned the 1990 Formula 1 World Champion at one of the most controversial moments in F1's history. Prost later stated Senna's reckless driving as being disgusting, and was apparently considering leaving the sport entirely after the incident. At the next race, F1 champion Jackie Stewart interviewed Senna and brought up a number of controversial moments, including what had just happened. Senna was annoyed because he thought Stewart would have understood the pressure drivers are under, and it was at this point where he said his most famous quote.
You should know that by being a racing driver, you are under risk all the time. And by being a racing driver means you are racing with other people. And if you no longer go for a gap that exists, you're no longer a racing driver.
So by this point, Senna was a double world champion, and the following year in 1991, he would become a triple world champion. Unlike his last 2 championships, Senna won the 1991 title by quite some margin from second place Nigel Mansell. For Senna though, this wasn't the biggest highlight of the year, since there had always been one Grand Prix he could never seem to win, and that was the Brazilian Grand Prix. Senna was loved by everyone in his home country of Brazil, and to win there would be the ultimate goal. On the 24th of March 1991, that year's Brazilian Grand Prix began with AYRTON Senna on pole position. Senna stormed ahead of everyone else, building up a substantial lead from second place Williams driver Nigel Mansell. He was comfortably in the lead until lap 50, where he suddenly started having gearbox issues, with him losing 4th gear. Mansell was now rapidly catching up to Senna until miraculously he had gearbox issues as well, sending his Williams into a spin and out of the race. By the closing laps of the race, however, Senna's gearbox got worse, with the only viable option being to drive to the finish stuck in 6th gear. The now second place Riccardo Patrese was closing in on him, but Senna managed to fend him off and win the race by a mere 2.9 seconds. Senna had finally done it. He had won his home Grand Prix, and his reaction speaks for itself. "1991 would be the final time Senna would be champion, but in the years that followed he produced some of his greatest moments. For example, at the 1992 Belgian Grand Prix at Spa, driver Eric Comas had a massive accident and was left unconscious in his car with his foot stuck on the accelerator. Instead of carrying on, Senna bravely decided to get out of his car and risk his own safety by running across the track to help his fellow driver. Senna cut off the car's engine in case of a fire and supported his neck until a medical team could arrive and take Comas to hospital. Eric Comas later stated that Senna's selfless act undoubtedly saved his life. Senna ended the 1992 season in 4th behind Michael Schumacher, Riccardo Patrese and the world champion Nigel Mansell. It was clear to everyone that McLaren's dominance was finally over and the likes of Williams and Benetton were taking over. This didn't stop Senna in his inferior McLaren from producing one of the greatest laps in F1 history. On the 11th of April 1993, Senna qualified 4th at the European Grand Prix at Donington Park, and after a bad start he dropped down to 5th straight away. Miraculously though, Senna managed to climb from 5th to 1st in just a single lap, passing Michael Schumacher, Karl Wendlinger, Damon Hill and his arch-rival Alain Prost. This lap, nicknamed the Lap of Gods, eventually led to Senna winning the race from one of the greatest drives the world has ever seen. Senna ended the 1993 champion in 2nd, behind that year's champion Alain Prost, and by the end of the year he was planning on leaving McLaren for the dominant Williams. After reigning world champion Alain Prost retired from F1, AYRTON Senna took his seat at Williams ahead of the 1994 season. After winning all 3 of his championships and 35 race wins with them, his time at McLaren was finally over. Little did anyone know the 1994 season would become one of the darkest years in F1 history after the 1994 San Marino Grand Prix at Imola. During qualifying, driver Roland Ratzenberger suffered issues with his front wing and slammed headfirst into a concrete wall, leaving him severely injured. Later that day in hospital, it was announced that Ratzenberger had died as a result of the crash, making him the first fatality in an F1 Grand Prix in the last 12 years. Ratzenberger was a promising talent, and he clearly shouldn't have been taken away at the age of only 33. After this, the head of the medical team, Professor Sid Watkins, remembers Senna breaking down and crying on his shoulder. Senna was clearly distraught, and later on Watkins attempted to persuade Senna not to race. What else do you need to do? You've been champion 3 times, you're obviously the quickest driver, give it up and let's go fishing. Senna responded to Watkins by saying, "There are certain things over which we have no control. I cannot quit, I have to go on." The next day, on the 1st of May 1994, the race began with Senna on pole position and Michael Schumacher beside him on the front row of the grid. And on lap 2 of the race, Senna speared off the track at Tamburello Corner at 190 miles per hour into a concrete barrier. The race was immediately stopped and medical teams swarmed what was left of Senna's Williams in the hope that he was okay. Much like Ratzenberger the day before, Senna had suffered severe injuries. But sadly, later that day, everyone's fears were confirmed. Ayrton Senna da Silva had died aged 34 at Imola Circuit on the 1st of May 1994. Ayrton Senna is considered by many as the greatest racing driver of all time, and from this video I hope you can now see why. He is a true legend of motorsport whose bravery and determination on track were second to none. Senna was taken too soon and his legacy should be remembered forever. The same can also be said for Ratzenberger, who was also an amazing talent taken way before his time. But anyway guys, I hope you enjoyed this video. If you did, be sure to like, comment and subscribe, and I'll see you all next Sunday for another video. Bye!